Charles Darwin was the fifth of 6 children. He grew up in a wealthy family. His father was a physician, and he owned a lot of land. But Darwin's life was not without at least a little bit of tragedy. His mother died when he was just 8 years old, and not being the firstborn, he knew he would not inherit his father's land. He needed to either pursue a career in the church or as a doctor, so he set off to Christ College in Cambridge. By coincidence, he stayed in the same room as William Paley, the author of Natural Theology, a book that Darwin read amongst many others. So Darwin began his scientific career as a natural theologian, much like William Paley, assuming that organisms are as they are meant to be, creations of God, never changing. But he ended up changing his mind, and it all started with a voyage. Back in the mid-1800s, the captain of a ship was a gentleman, and the men who crewed the ship, well, they were not. So when Captain Robert Fitzroy agreed to command the Beagle, a boat, not a dog, he insisted that someone come along as his quote-unquote gentleman companion. So Darwin joined on, basically going on this voyage to be an educated and suitable companion for Captain Fitzroy. For 5 years, from 1831 to 1836, they sailed around the world. This map shows the path of the voyage and the many stops along the way. They started in Plymouth and went south to Brazil, down around South America, back up to the Galapagos just off of Ecuador, over to New Zealand, Australia, Mauritius, around the southern tip of Africa, back up to Brazil, up to Cape Verde, the Azores, and then home. The boat would stop, and Darwin and others would get off, wander around, check things out. Darwin, being a naturalist, collected. He caught, he shot many animals, or rather his he had an assistant who did all of this. Anyway, they documented where the animals were found, they stuffed them, and put them in trunks to take back to England with them. This is what naturalists did at the time. And this is how museums across Europe ended up amassing huge collections of animals from all around the world. But Darwin didn't just put them in a box and forget about them. He pondered the new things he was seeing. For 5 years, across many oceans and many seas, and he read. His Majesty's ship, the Beagle, was not really a very big boat. You can get a sense of it here, looking at the dining area in the middle for scale. In the captain's cabin, there was really just room for Darwin and Fitzroy at the small dining table. So Darwin couldn't take all that much stuff with him. He had to pack light. But he did take some books. The days before smartphones and tablets, one would become very familiar with the few books they had with them on such a long trip, reading them over and over again. One of the books that Darwin took with him was a new one, published in 1830, titled Principles of Geology. This was written by Charles Lyell. This book is revolutionary to the geological sciences because in it, Lyell outlined the concept of uniformitarianism. This is the idea that the present is the key to understanding the past. Lyell proposed that geological change is mostly the steady accumulation of minute changes over a long span of time. Like the mountain you see here, the various layers of rock, one on top of the other. Lyell proposed that this kind of sedimentation was not from one giant flood like the catastrophes of Cuvier, but rather many thousands of years of gradual accumulation on the ocean floor or in a lake. Remember that during this time, natural historians were thinking of the world around them in terms of how the Bible articulated its formation. God had created all of this, and had done so just 4,000 years ago. Lyell's proposal that gradual change built up over many, many years meant that the Earth must be much older than 4,000 years. It was a radical thought. And Darwin read this over and over again while sailing on the Beagle. Charles Darwin took notes on a lot of observations from a lot of different places over those 5 years. For example, as he sailed around the coastline of South America, he was introduced to the rich fossil record that is exposed there, providing him with a glimpse of what animals looked like in this region back in the past. And sailing around the coastline also gave him a sense of how plants and animals change across geography. These were not always dramatic shifts, but often gradual, and yet, after some time, the animals were quite different from the ones he saw many hundreds of kilometers back. And then there were the ocean islands, and the variety of animals he saw there. The Galapagos Islands, just west of Ecuador, are perhaps the most closely tied to Darwin's insights. The Galapagos Islands were formed by volcanoes about 3 million years ago, which is pretty recent in geological time. While the biological diversity on these islands was absolutely essential to Darwin recognizing the important role that variation plays in evolution, when you look at the islands, they're somewhat barren. Back in the early 2000s, I got to attend the first World Summit on Evolution, hosted by the Ecuadorian government, actually in the Galapagos, so on the Galapagos Islands. What an amazing experience. I want to share some of my photos with you. There are, of course, plants and animals, and they have spent much of their existence without humans around. And you can see it's kind of not that spectacular at first glance, but once you look close. Here are some sea lions and marine iguanas. I did not have a very nice camera at the time, so I really was about that close. The animals, they just aren't scared of you. And so there are a lot of rules about not getting too close and letting the animals have the run of the land. So for example, if you need to walk out on the path to get to your boat, you have to wait for the sea lions and iguana to decide to move. Here's another marine iguana. So majestic. And the birds, they are spectacular. Here are 2 albatross, and they're clicking their beaks against each other in a very elaborate mating ritual. Right there, in front of me. You could almost step on them. But what you could really almost step on, and what are perhaps my favorite birds, are the blue-footed boobies. Look at that! Their feet are literally blue. Since we were all there for the World Summit on Evolution, there were a lot of famous evolutionary biologists. This is Doug Fujiyama. He wrote a very popular textbook, and I was a bit starstruck, to say the least. He's a professor at SUNY Stony Brook, and a few years ago, I was there to give a talk in their departmental seminar series. He was in the audience, which made me kind of nervous. And I had kind of hoped he'd remember having shared these cool times in the Galapagos together, but he didn't. But, that's okay. I have this photographic evidence. Anyway, we better get back to Darwin. Now, Darwin's name is tightly linked, actually, to another kind of bird on the Galapagos, and that's the finches. In this figure, you can see 14 different types of finch arranged in a circle. Notice the variation in the color of their feathers and beaks, variation in the size and the shape of the beaks. So the finches cluster into 4 groups based on the depth and the length of the beaks. And these 4 groups correspond to the types of food the birds primarily eat. The larger, more robust-beaked birds mainly eat seeds. The long, skinnier beaked finches eat insects. And then there is the one type of finch that eats fruits, and others that eat cactus parts. But they're all finches, and they all look a lot like the type of finch that Darwin had seen on the mainland in Ecuador. What was up with that? Why were there so many minor variations on the finch theme in the Galapagos? So could it be that a long time ago, some finch from the mainland ended up on these islands, and that, or I guess finches, ended up on these islands, and that they gradually changed such that their beaks were better suited to the kinds of foods that were available to them on each island? But species are immutable. But God would not be whimsical in making a bunch of different, but so similar, kinds of finches all so close to each other. Or could it be that Lyell's idea about geology might also apply to organisms? Could organisms gradually change over time in ways that make them more suited to their environment? Could these islands be a model for how animals move into new lands? As Darwin thought about these things, he pulled together 4 key observations. First, he observed that organisms tend to produce more offspring than needed to keep the population size stable. And yet, the population size stays stable. What does this mean? Well, it means there's a lot of death. Now, Darwin had been thinking a bit about death, so 2 years after returning from the voyage of the Beagle, Darwin read a book written in 1798 by Thomas Malthus, and the book is called An Essay on the Principle of Population. Malthus was a demographer, so he thought about human populations, not about animals, but he made an important point that stuck in Darwin's thinking, and it is this. So consider this graph. You have time on the x-axis, so it increases to the right, and on the y-axis, you plot some measure of quantity, which increases as you go up. Malthus noticed that the resources that a group of people can produce increases linearly, the amount of food you can grow and produce, so just a linear increase. But he noticed that people have more children than needed to replace themselves, and so do those children. This means that population grows exponentially, not linearly. And so, at a certain point in time, those 2 lines are going to cross. And that intersection is when the needs of the population exceed the resources needed to keep them alive. A point of crisis is reached. So Darwin thought about how this same concept applies to animals, and he continued with his observations. He noticed that variation is an innate characteristic of life. Individuals, they vary. And he also noticed that offspring tend to look like their parents, so this means that kids inherit this variation. Okay, so, conclusion 1. There was a lot of death. Now, this means that in nature, yes, there's a lot of death, but that death is not usually randomly distributed. That variation that Darwin observed within and between populations of finches, well, what if the finches with the larger beaks in a population were better at breaking open seeds, and so they fared better, having more offspring? And those offspring had inherited the larger beak, so they too were better at breaking open seeds. So the variation was key to surviving in different environments. Those individuals who were better suited to the environment, they were more likely to survive and have more offspring. The variation that gave them the advantage would increase in occurrence as more of their descendants survived into the later generations. So there is variation among individuals, and death is not usually randomly distributed. So you put all of this together, and conclusion 2 is that, there is survival of the fittest. This concept has come to be known as survival of the fittest, but Darwin, he didn't actually come up with this phrase, but he did embrace it. The credit goes to this guy named Herbert Spencer, an economist. In 1864, Spencer wrote a book that took the principles of evolution by natural selection and applied it to economics in what is called social Darwinism. We're going to talk more about that later, but for now, Spencer, the economist, he came up with the phrase, and it stuck. So let's summarize what Darwin concluded. Darwin said that the natural variation in a population was selected on by the environment, and over time, this selection would cause the range of variation observed in a population to shift. This change over time is what we call evolution. So this is natural selection. as it is the environment that serves as the selective filter. In contrast, there's artificial selection, which is essentially the same process, but instead of the environment being the agent of selection, people are. Now, let's walk through an example of evolution by natural selection. So evolution is change over time, and natural selection is when the environment favors one range of the variation more than another. Let's use Lamarck's giraffes, so it's easy to see how Lamarck's explanation of change over time differs from Darwin's. We will imagine two different environments 5,000 years ago. So the first one is 5,000 years ago. You have a giraffe hanging out in a pretty lush area, lots of trees and bushes of various heights. Now, the environment today is much more sparse. There are just a few trees, and they're not close together. So we, hypothetically, measured the length of the giraffe necks, and I've color-coded them here. The longer the neck, the darker the shading in the box. In white, the giraffe neck is less than 1 meter, and in the darkest block, the neck is between 1.6 and 1.7 meters. Let's plot some data. So, we measured the neck length of many giraffe from 3 different time periods. The y-axis tells you what percentage of the individuals in that population have necks in the length categories represented by the shaded boxes. So here you see data from 5,000 years ago. Notice that there is a bit of variation. About 10% of the individuals have necks that are less than 1 meter in length, and there are some giraffe that have necks that are 1.5 meters in length, but they represent only about 15% of the population. Most individuals are somewhere in the middle of the range of variation. Now, since the leaves on the trees can be found at lower and higher heights, all of these giraffe are doing pretty well. Here are data from 2,500 years ago. Now, there aren't any giraffe with necks less than 1 meter in length, and we see a few with even longer necks than what we observed 5,000 years ago. The range of variation overall is similar to what we saw at 5,000 years ago, but notice that it's shifted upwards. There's more of the darker shades. The environment has started to shift, and there are fewer and fewer small trees. The giraffe with longer necks have an easier time reaching the higher up leaves. Now today, leaves are very rarely found at the lower heights that we saw 5,000 years ago. Here are the hypothetical data for giraffe neck length today. Notice that even more giraffe have the longer necks. Only about 10% have necks that are just about 1 meter in length. You can see in the color shift that the length of the necks has shifted over time. This shift, this is evolution by natural selection. The changing environment, the loss of the lower leaves on the trees, that meant that the giraffe with the longer necks managed to get enough to eat, and they did better than giraffe with shorter necks. Longer-necked giraffe had more offspring, and those offspring inherited their parents' longer neck. Now, they didn't get their longer neck because their parents reached up way high and stretched their necks. The parents just happened to have longer necks because there is variation in the population. So you can see how that changes. So change over time is caused by differential reproductive success. This calls a little bit, though. This calls, though, for some definitions to make sure we're on the same page. So, fitness. In biology, we call reproductive success fitness, and an individual's fitness is defined as success in promoting survival of one's own genes, measured relative to other individuals. It's kind of like the bear joke. How fast do you have to run to escape from a bear? Well, just faster than the person you are with. Let's do a little quiz and see if we got it. Am I really the only one who laughed at that joke? Every year. Okay, so here's your quiz. Who is more fit? Is it A, this one, or B, this one? You're right. We cannot know from the data presented here. The fitness we are talking about is reproductive fitness. So really, the person to be most impressed by in terms of reproductive fitness isn't either of these guys, it's this man, Mr. Chana. He has 94 children and 33 grandchildren. Kinda makes me feel like such a slacker for only having one child. In terms of evolutionary fitness, I definitely put all my eggs in one basket. Mr. Chana is much more successful. So, a very important point here is that reproductive success is not how many times you participate in mating behavior. It is about how many children you have who themselves grow up to have children, who 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 grow up to have children. Let's get back to Darwin. So he came home from the voyage on the Beagle. He got married to his cousin Emma. He had children of his own. And all the while, he had all these ideas rattling around inside his head. He knew that this was controversial, that people would be very, very skeptical and upset, not the least of which might be his wife. Now the idea, it went against the religious viewpoint that he had held, and that was so important to those around him. He spent a lot of time posing hypotheses about evolution by natural selection, testing those hypotheses, and trying, over and over again, to show that he was wrong. He kept collecting data to see if he could demonstrate that the hypothesis was not right. So, he wasn't in a hurry to publish. He wasn't attracted to controversy. Darwin wanted to make sure that he had squared all his corners, dotted all his I's, and crossed all of his T's. Then Alfred Russel Wallace showed up on the scene. So Wallace also read Lyell and Malthus and Darwin's notes from the Beagle. Now Wallace wasn't from a wealthy family like Darwin, but he aspired to be a natural historian like Darwin. So he figured out a way through British military service to get to the Malay archipelago, where he stayed from 1854 to 1862. Now there's a lot of malaria in that area of the world, and Wallace came down with a bout of it. In the midst of a malarial fever, it came to him. He made all the same connections that Darwin did, and realized that animals could change over time through the process of natural selection. When he felt better, he hurriedly wrote it all down and mailed it off to someone who could give him honest feedback on whether or not this was a good idea. Who do you think he sent it to? Yep, he sent it to Mr. Charles Darwin. Now, Darwin received the letter on the 18th of June, 1858, and realized he was about to be scooped. Darwin, though, had been writing letters to colleagues for decades about his idea, and his dear friend Charles Lyell, yes, the geology guy, he figured out a way to handle the situation. Less than 2 weeks later, 2 papers were presented to the Linnean Society. One was read on behalf of Alfred Russel Wallace, and the other was read by Charles Darwin. They both presented their ideas, the idea they had both stumbled upon independently. And apparently, there wasn't much of a reaction that day. But then Darwin worked frantically to pull it all together. The next year, 1859, he published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. This book is the foundation of the theory of evolution by natural selection. It is so meticulously written, so thorough, and such a straightforward walk through the hypothesis, the tests of the hypothesis, that it still stands as a remarkable piece of science. Let's wrap up by summarizing Darwin's main contributions. 3 of them. There's 3 main contributions. First, he collected evidence to document the occurrence of evolution. Second, he provided a natural mechanism for evolution, that natural selection is the creative force behind evolution. And third, he established a methodology and developed criteria for inferring the processes we cannot see from the results that have been preserved. Now, as an evolutionary biologist myself, I owe Darwin a debt of gratitude for how well he laid the foundation for how to do historical science. How do you scientifically investigate things that happened in the past? Darwin figured it out. Evolution by natural selection. Let's do a little recap, though, to make sure we have it. So, 3 parts. Evolution by natural selection in 3 parts. 1. There is the principle of variation. There is variation in morphological, physiological, and behavioral traits among members of a species. 2. The principle of heredity. The variation is in part heritable, so individuals resemble their relatives more than they resemble unrelated individuals, and in particular, offspring resemble their parents. And 3. Different variants leave different numbers of offspring, either in immediate or in remote generations. This is the principle of differential fitness. It's so simple, it's so straightforward, and that was the beauty of Darwin's contribution to evolution as a science. So, points to keep in mind. 1, that science is a way to answer questions through observation. And 2nd, that Charles Darwin, he wasn't the first naturalist to notice that animals and plants looked different in the past and in different places, but he was the first to propose a mechanism to explain why this is the case without evoking teleology. This was science.